Welcome back to the Food Forest. It's been a while since a video. It's not that I haven't been trying to make a video, because I've actually tried to make a few videos specifically on the latest developments in climate change, what's going on with things like sea surface temperatures right now, what's going on with the ice pack levels that are in specifically northern Canada, but really right across the world, temperature records that are getting shattered, and like 370, 380 consecutive days of record temperatures in the oceans. Some of these things that are going on, though, I really want to be careful with this channel, because my main goal with this channel is not only to inform people about the science that's going on in the world, and specifically with environmental activism, with regenerative agriculture, but also to empower people to do the things that we actually need to do to try to make some kind of difference. And that is really teaching people how to garden. That's what the roots of this channel are. Teaching people how to garden through the science of gardening and through the lens of permaculture, which is, the way that humans can exist on this planet long term. That being said, there's not a whole lot of good news lately, and all the videos that I've tried to make, they come across really doomerism, and I'm a forever optimist despite the challenges that we face. Now, I'm certain that catabolic collapse, is the only way that humanity is actually going to be able to live sustainably on this earth, and that we're not going to change until we actually experience the pain that's going to come with some of this stuff. For example, on an exponential curve, if you've always lived your life in the early portion of the curve, it's very easy to develop a mentality of, I've heard of this all before and nothing's really changed. It's only once we get to the exponential portions of the curve where we think, oh shoot, we probably should have listened to those silly scientists in the 1970s. A lot of people who are kind of anti-climate science, one of their big bugaboos is Al Gore. But here's an interesting thing about Al Gore. Al Gore has been screaming about the climate since 1980 or so. There's been papers done by ExxonMobil, for example, in the 1970s about the impact of their business on climate. In fact, there's actual scientific literature from the 1800s, well before the Industrial Revolution, on the impact of climate change. A lot of people who are skeptical of it really latch on to Al Gore. And the reason for this is that for the baby boomer generation, for example, born in the 1950s or so, that by the time Al Gore was screaming and ranting about climate change, they were in their 30s and 40s. This is the 1980s to the 1990s. So Al Gore, for a lot of people, is the voice of climate change for them. But here's an interesting statistic. Since 1990, well after Al Gore was the voice of climate change, humanity has actually doubled our emissions from 1990 to the beginning of human existence, hundreds of millions of years. We're talking about hundreds of millions of years of clearing and cutting forests for agriculture, wide crop burning in order to reset lands, and then the entire Industrial Revolution right up into the 1970s with the oil and gas explosion in consumption well into the 1990s. All of that dwarfs in comparison to what we've done since then. And at our current pace, our next doubling is not going to be 30 or 40 years. It's going to be roughly 20 years. And there's enough oil and gas in the ground to support that next doubling. We're already seeing crazy things happening in the world. For example, the permafrost today is melting at levels not expected in the IPCC reports until the year 2090. A lot of what we declare as emergency levels for climate change is a temperature rise above the baseline before Industrial Revolution. What a lot of people don't know is when they hear, 1.5 degrees of global warming, what they don't understand is how that is measured. That's actually measured not as the temperature today, because, weather versus climate is very different. So, for example, the fact that it's been extremely warm in March doesn't necessarily scare me as much as the fact that it has been 380 days of consecutive record-breaking temperatures. That's more concerning to me. This weather right now, we've had abnormal weather in the past. Yes, it's getting more frequent and worse, but we've had it in the past. So you have to cancel out all the noise. So how scientists do that is with a rolling average. And this is what we use for declaring our average above baseline temperatures. The problem for that is rolling averages are really good at taking a really noisy chart and finding a general trend baseline through it, getting a best fit line, through a fairly noisy chart and saying, hey, there's actually a declining trend or a rising trend. It's very moderate and slight, but we can see it when we take a 10-year rolling average. What a 10-year rolling average is really poor at doing, though, is taking a known very, very tight line that's going up and then extrapolating where we are today based off of the 10-year rolling average. Because where we are today is obviously at the end of that very consistently rising chart. So even though we're not at 1.5 degrees of warming above industrial baseline temperatures in terms of a 10-year rolling average, we're well pushed beyond that. Now, to explain how bad it is to get to 1.5 or 2 or 2.5 or 3, some of the largest extinctions in the history of the Earth, for example, a 75% reduction in all living life on the planet, occurred at only plus 3 degrees Celsius above the baseline. We had a 96% loss of all life on Earth in an extinction event where we went to plus 10 degrees Celsius. The difference between going from 1.5 to 2 to 2.5 to 2.6 to 2.7 is increasingly exponential consequences, sometimes triggering feedback loops that cannot be prevented and go into runaway mode. These runaway modes will then take us to the 3, the 4, the 5, the 6 degrees Celsius. Now, the temperature has risen before in the past, in Earth's geological past, but it rises slower. It rises over millennia, thousands of years, sometimes even hundreds of thousands of years. Humanity's managed to do what a natural cycle in the world would have done in 100 years that would have taken hundreds of thousands or millions of years. The rate matters so much. We're currently sitting around 1.2 to 1.3 degrees using that 10-year baseline, but there's been some recent studies in studying corals and sponges that has actually shown that we're probably closer to 1.6. Additionally, we have a lot of aerosol masking going on. Aerosols is kind of the geoengineering trick that we would do if we wanted to blot out the sun in a really desperate attempt to cling on to human civilization. We would release a bunch of sulfates into the air. Now, one of the things that happened in the shipping industry over the last fall is that a lot of the sulfate emissions were actually restricted. So what is going to happen in the next few years is as those sulfate particles come out of the air, we're actually going to start to see what the true warming that we've actually done. And specifically, it's going to happen over the ocean transportation pathways that these ships would have polluted. This is just one of the ways that we kind of can paint ourselves into a box where we release a bunch of pollution and we want to clean our airs and sky, get clean water, stop emitting so much pollution, but in doing so, the very cleaning of our skies is going to create further warming effects because we're going to be losing the aerosol effect that's a masking effect. Additionally, with the disproportionate warming in the Arctic, we're actually looking to have a blue ocean event sometime between 2030 and 2035 now estimated, whereas in the early IPCC reports, that was not estimated to happen until 2080 to the year 2100. Now, all of these things happening faster than expected is a bit of a joke in the climate science space. And it's understandable why. For example, in the 1970s to 1980s, there were a few papers that were actually predicting a global cooling. And this has been used by climate skeptics for the following 50 years to try to discredit and disprove climate science. One of the reasons why they thought that we were going to actually cool was because of this aerosol masking effect and the historical global trend of Earth's temperatures going down for the last roughly 2,000 years. In response to the aerosol issues in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, humanity and governments around the world actually came together and solved an accord called the Montreal Protocol in order to ban certain substances in refrigeration units, for example, aerosols that would make it into the air that would destroy the ozone layer and also act as aerosols that block out some of the sunlight. the Earth coming together and solving a crisis. You know, people sometimes say, well, whatever happened to the ozone layer? Whatever happened to acid rain? You know, these were things that climate scientists were screaming about in the past, and that never came to fruition. Well, yeah, it's because humanity actually came together to solve them. In fact, the idea that scientists at one point thought that there was a consensus on global cooling is completely false. There were only a handful of papers that were pushing a global cooling narrative. But even in the 70s and 80s, the vast majority of science was agreeing that global warming was actually what was going to be coming. The term then got changed to climate change because it more accurately represents what humanity is going to face. Yes, there is going to be a global warming, but it's climate, not weather. There's going to be periods of very, very, very cold weather patterns that happen when things like the polar vortex, the jet stream, and the AMOC break down. AMOC is the Atlantic Meridian Ocean Current. When these weather patterns break down, we're going to see more extreme weather. Sometimes that's going to be more rain, sometimes it's going to be less rain, sometimes it's going to be heat waves, and sometimes it's going to be cold snaps. And at this point, I don't really know how to convince anybody if they don't want to use their own eyes and observations to see what's going on. So we're going to start moving in this channel away from, convincing people to believe in climate change to questioning, do you understand climate change? And the reason for this is that the people who still refuse to believe, despite insurance companies all changing their policies in order to address climate change, despite global petroleum companies acknowledging climate change, despite agreements at the COP summit in an oil state all agreeing to phase out the use of coal, oil, and gas. The only people who don't want to still believe in climate change are frankly never going to believe in climate change. And it's because they don't understand climate change. Now, this is a very dangerous position for me to take on a gardening channel because a lot of my viewers come from the homesteading crowd, and the homesteading crowd often tends to come from areas where there's a lot of misinformation socially in your social circles on climate change, mostly because of the news media organization of Fox News. But like I said, you can't reason a person out of a position that they didn't use reason to get into. And at the end of the day, what matters is what you can do. So what you can do is to work on adapting your family to the realities of the future. How is your family going to be able to handle a future where global supply chains might start breaking down, where you might not be able to go to the store and get food? This channel attempts to teach communities how to grow food. We should be growing food, not lawns, and we should be creating those social networks so we can trade the food that we grow. And we should be active and loud in our support of the environment. And from now until next January is going to be a very important time, specifically for people in the United States, for determining and choosing who they want to be in power in the most crucial years in human existence. I don't tend to like to get political on this YouTube channel, but at the same time, when one political party refuses to do anything about the severe challenges, the most severe challenge that humanity has ever faced, I think that there's only one correct solution. Unfortunately, in the United States, the Republicans don't believe in climate change. In Canada, the Conservatives don't believe in climate change. It's insane to me that we live in a time where this is actually the populist political position. Also unfortunate is that the alternatives to this are poor. In the United States, we have Joe Biden, who has actually been one of the most successful US presidents in terms of environmental policy. Despite what you think of him, the Inflation Reduction Act was the most important piece of climate legislation that has ever been passed. I don't agree with a lot of his positions, specifically his geopolitical positions and support of things that are going on in the rest of the world. I believe that countries should become a little bit more insular and take care of their own people, specifically in the future that we're coming into. That means building the infrastructure so that our own citizens in Canada and in the United States and elsewhere in the world can actually support and feed themselves, building community and the infrastructure for what life is going to look like beyond the age of oil. I don't believe that spending billions of dollars to blow people up is the best way for us globally to handle the future that we face. Our Conservative Party is led by Pierre Poilievre, who is a known climate denier. Our other alternative is Justin Trudeau, who I'm not a huge fan of. Now in Canada, we have a third party, the NDP, but the NDP don't believe that nuclear is a solution for our energy crisis. So between the three parties, we have really no good option in Canada. And I personally think between the two parties, you have really no good option in the United States in the coming election either. This isn't surprising because the machine of capitalism is going to pick leaders who propagate the machine. And in order to actually address climate change and overshoot, we actually have to dismantle and rebuild society in a new way. I don't know if we're going to be able to do that. And I don't typically like the lesser of two evils mentality, but I think in the next year, it's something that people will have to consider. With that said, I'm going to leave everyone up to their own choice. I really wish I had someone better to vote for in Canada, and I'm sure everyone watching in the United States does as well. I think we'll just stop there. On my next video, I'm going to do a little bit of a walk around tour. We're going to talk about less of this climate change stuff. We're going to move away from that probably in the next year as it gets warmer. Now we're going to focus on the gardening and teaching you and inspiring you on things that you can do to help build the resilience in your own family. Last year around this time, I had a video called "This is Your Wake-Up Call, Start a Garden." If you didn't listen to it last year, make sure you listen to it this year because it's getting ever more important year after year. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next one.